Winter, 1819. Charleston pulsed with commerce, yet beneath its bustling trade ran a current of dread. The harbor brimmed with tall ships carrying cotton and rice, but beyond the waterfront, lawless stretches of road harbored whispers of violence. The smell of tar, rope, and salt clung to the port air, masking the unease that spread through taverns and market stalls. Travelers arriving in Charleston rarely lingered outside the city walls after sundown. Locals spoke of robberies, ambushes, and gangs that preyed upon the unwary. The 6 Mile House, a modest inn along the road north of Charleston, earned a reputation both as a place of welcome and of menace. For weary strangers, the faint glow of its lantern might promise food and shelter. For residents of Charleston, that same glow stirred something darker. The city at this time was a place of contrasts. Wealthy planters displayed silver on dining tables while enslaved men and women carried burdens through narrow cobblestone alleys. Merchants called out at the busy exchange, voices competing with the crash of hooves and wagons. Yet even in the glow of prosperity, there was fear of the open road. Many of the outlying houses functioned as inns, but not all were to be trusted. At taverns, men nursed rum and repeated stories about travelers who left Charleston and were never seen again. They spoke of drivers whose carts were found abandoned along the highway, of merchants who vanished between the city gates and the countryside. And in those hushed stories, one name appeared again and again: an innkeeper's wife, Lavinia Fisher. Before unraveling her legend, consider how such tales spread. Fear has a way of clinging to details, shaping memory into myth. In Charleston, with its heavy air and scent of pine smoke drifting from cook fires, rumor grew thick and stubborn. And like smoke, it carried the suggestion of danger everywhere. If you've ever walked a dark road with the weight of an unseen story pressing on your mind, you know the way these legends breathe. That is the atmosphere in which Charleston's most infamous tale took shape. And if you're drawn to stories where fact and folklore intertwine, consider sharing this journey with others. Like, share, and subscribe so that more can uncover the truth buried in history's shadows. The people of Charleston could not ignore the strange accounts that crept closer each season. Some believed a gang was responsible. Others whispered about a husband and wife who lured unsuspecting travelers into danger. Whether true or not, those stories fanned embers of suspicion into open flame. By the late 1810s, the inn at 6 Mile had become a symbol of unease. Visitors described the house in stark terms: a plain wooden structure with a wide porch. Its shutters rattled when the coastal wind blew in from the marshes. The lantern by the door flickered, sending light across the dirt road where travelers approached. Horses whinnied uneasily, as if they too sensed what men dared only to whisper. Inside, the air carried the aroma of boiled tea and wood smoke, yet beneath it, some guests swore they caught a bitter trace, like herbs ground into powder. The story of Charleston's fear begins here, on that road leading out of the city, where travelers placed their trust in strangers for a night's rest. It was the perfect stage for rumor to grow, for shadowed figures to loom larger than life. And at the center of it all stood Lavinia Fisher, whose name would one day be spoken not as that of a hostess, but as a warning. As suspicion thickened and more voices joined the chorus of unease, the line between truth and legend blurred. Soon, one inn would come to embody Charleston's fear of the unknown, and the Fishers themselves would become the focus of wrath and retribution. The path from rumor to arrest was long and tangled, but in Charleston, whispers had a way of turning into action. And it was action, angry, violent, and determined, that would soon sweep the 6 Mile House into infamy. Next comes the house itself, a place both ordinary and chilling, where guests entered seeking comfort, but found themselves ensnared in one of America's earliest legends. Spring, 1819. Along the dusty road that stretched north from Charleston, travelers often found their gaze drawn to a plain wooden building standing alone in the wilderness. It was called the 6 Mile House, named for its distance from the city gates. On the surface, it appeared no different from other roadside inns, A wide porch, a lantern burning by the door, horses tethered at a rail, and smoke drifting upward from a kitchen hearth. Yet behind that unremarkable frame, stories began to gather like storm clouds. The smell of pine from the surrounding woods mixed with the sharp odor of animal sweat as riders dismounted in the yard. Guests were ushered inside, where the wooden floor creaked underfoot and the walls bore dark stains from years of smoke and grease. A simple counter displayed jugs of liquor and battered mugs, while upstairs, narrow rooms with straw-stuffed mattresses awaited those willing to pay for rest. But the atmosphere of the house was heavy, as though unseen eyes followed every movement. In Charleston, the 6 Mile House developed a reputation that went beyond its plain appearance. Locals whispered that gangs of highwaymen used it as a meeting ground. Travelers said they were watched too closely at their tables, their conversations measured as if weighed for profit. At the center of these rumors were the innkeepers, Lavinia and John Fisher. To some, they appeared as ordinary proprietors, Lavinia striking in her presence with dark hair and an air of command, John, wiry and restless, known for sharp eyes that missed little. Yet together they seemed to inspire more unease than comfort. Guests reported being offered steaming cups of tea upon arrival, the fragrance strong, laced with herbs that left a faint bitterness on the tongue. Some drained their cups and felt lightheaded afterward. Others, wary of the taste, claimed to sense danger hidden in the drink. The account spread quickly in Charleston, where every tale sharpened suspicion. The rooms upstairs added to the lore. Beds were said to creak and shift strangely beneath the weight of a sleeper. More fantastical rumors insisted that trapdoors waited beneath the mattresses, designed to collapse and hurl victims into darkness. Though such claims were never proven, they fed the imagination of a city already primed to believe the worst. The smell of boiled tea lingered in the stories told by those who survived. For some, it was only a bitter taste. For others, it became a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that hospitality could mask menace. Charleston's newspapers carried pieces about rising crime along the roads, fueling the notion that the 6 Mile House was no mere inn. Its reputation hardened, not a refuge, but a snare. Soon the name Fisher was spoken with distrust, linked inextricably to tales of poisoned cups and vanished guests. As word spread, fewer locals dared to pass the inn after sundown. Horses quickened their pace when their riders glimpsed the flicker of its lantern. The 6 Mile House had become a place of shadows, where suspicion grew thicker than the smoke from its chimney. And it was here, within these walls, that Charleston's darkest legend began to root itself. But a legend does not take hold without witnesses, and one man's harrowing escape would soon give substance to rumor, thrusting the Fishers and their inn into the center of fear. Summer, 1819. Charleston's taverns grew restless with talk of disappearances, and the name most often spoken was tied to the inn that stood 6 miles north of the city gates. The 6 Mile House had become more than a roadside dwelling. It was a story told in low voices over mugs of ale, punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the clatter of dice. Each telling sharpened the edges of rumor into menace. The scent of pipe smoke filled these rooms where men leaned forward, describing travelers who had vanished after spending a night under the Fishers' roof. Some said the guests had been seen enjoying supper, but never arrived at their next destination. Their horses were found wandering near the roadside, saddles still strapped, reins dragging in the dirt. The air of Charleston seemed to thicken with unease as these stories spread, each repetition adding darker hues to the portrait of the innkeepers. At the heart of the tales was Lavinia Fisher herself. Witnesses described her as striking, almost commanding, with eyes that could soften into charm or harden into suspicion. In one account, she greeted guests with unusual warmth, pressing tea upon them even before they set down their travel packs. The drink, though fragrant with herbs, carried a bitterness that lingered on the tongue. Those who emptied the cup often grew drowsy, their eyelids heavy as if pulled down by invisible hands. Then came the most chilling element of the legend: the beds upstairs. Rumors swirled that beneath their patched quilts and straw mattresses lay contraptions designed not for rest, but for death. Some swore that trapdoors gave way without warning, hurling the sleeper into a pit. Others insisted spikes waited below, hidden until it was too late. Though no court record would ever confirm these devices, the power of the image, the sudden fall, the impossible escape, seared itself into Charleston's imagination. The motif of tea returned again and again. Survivors who refused to drink recalled its sharp smell, as though bitter leaves had been ground too fine. To them, it was not a beverage, but a signal, a warning cloaked in hospitality. One man later told of feigning sleep in a bed at the inn, only to rise and slip away in the night, convinced that danger hovered with every creak of the floorboards. Around Charleston, the frightening tales gained weight because they spoke to a common fear: the traveler far from home, placing trust in strangers. Roads at night carried the sounds of hooves striking dirt, the distant cry of owls, and the uneasy thought that not all lantern lights promised safety. The Fisher's Inn became the embodiment of that dread, a structure that looked ordinary, but, in rumor, concealed betrayal. As stories multiplied, Lavinia's name carried a new tone. She was no longer seen merely as an innkeeper's wife, but as a specter of danger, poisoner, temptress, accomplice to vanishing men. Charleston's citizens, stirred by fear, began to speak not just of suspicion, but of action. Soon, one traveler's tale would ignite that fear into certainty, giving the legend its most enduring detail: the poisoned tea and the desperate flight from 6 Mile House. Late winter, 1819. The road out of Charleston stretched empty beneath a pale sky, dust rising with each hoof fall. It was along this road that a traveler named John Peoples made his way, weary and seeking rest. His horse shivered in the evening air, its breath visible as mist. Ahead, the lantern of the 6 Mile House swung gently, throwing a dim circle of light across the dirt. Peoples dismounted, the smell of horse sweat clinging to his clothes, and stepped inside. The air within was heavy with wood smoke and the sharp tang of boiled tea. Lavinia Fisher greeted him with practiced charm, her presence commanding in the flickering glow of the hearth. She asked polite questions, where he came from, what his business might be, yet her eyes lingered too long, measuring, calculating. Before he could rest, she pressed a steaming cup of tea into his hands. Peoples raised it, inhaled the fragrance, and hesitated. The scent seemed off, pleasant at first, then strangely bitter. He set the cup aside, feigning courtesy but never taking a sip. Lavinia urged him again, her insistence cloaked in hospitality, but his caution remained firm. He smiled, declined, and claimed he wasn't fond of tea. Later, shown to a small upstairs room, Peoples felt unease deepen. The bed creaked as he sat upon it, the frame shifting oddly beneath his weight. The wooden floor beneath seemed unsteady, as though it concealed more than age. The air smelled faintly of damp straw and iron. Lying down only briefly, he let his breathing slow, pretending to drift into sleep. But suspicion pricked at him like needles. Rising quietly, he paced the room, then decided he could not risk the night. Gathering his belongings, Peoples stole into the hall, moving with careful steps so the boards would not betray him. The silence of the house pressed in. Only the soft hiss of the fire below reached his ears. His heart beat against his ribs as he slipped out the door and into the night. Outside, the cold air felt like release. He mounted his horse, the animal shifting nervously, and rode hard toward Charleston. Behind him, the lantern at 6 Mile swung in the darkness, fading with distance. He carried with him not only his life, but a story that would spread like wildfire. When Peoples told his tale in Charleston, it struck a chord of fear. He described Lavinia's insistent hospitality, the bitter tea, and the uneasy bed. He declared his certainty that the inn harbored foul play, that had he stayed the night he might not have lived to tell the story. His words echoed in taverns and across market stalls, retold with additions that magnified the terror. The motif of poisoned tea solidified here. For the citizens of Charleston, the bitter drink became a symbol of betrayal. A simple gesture turned deadly. Whether Peoples narrowly escaped murder or merely fled his own fear, his account transformed rumor into certainty. The 6 Mile House was no longer just suspicious, it was a trap. Soon others would step forward with stories of their own, and one attack, brazen and violent, would ignite the city into action, sealing the Fishers' fate in the eyes of their neighbors. Autumn, 1819. A trader named David Ross rode north of Charleston, his cart laden with goods and the dust of the road clinging to his boots. The late afternoon sun bled orange through the trees, casting long shadows across the highway. Ross had traveled this stretch before, wary but confident, his horse steady beneath the weight of harness and wagon. Yet this time, danger waited in the dimming light. As Ross approached the vicinity of the 6 Mile House, the stillness of the woods broke. A cluster of figures emerged from the roadside scrub, their movements sudden and menacing. The air carried the smell of sweat and leather, mingling with the startled snort of his horse. Without warning, the men descended upon him. Ross was dragged from his seat, fists striking, voices rising in angry shouts. He fought back, the coarse dirt grinding into his palms as he struggled against their grip. The clash filled the air with the sound of grunts, the thud of boots, the scrape of metal as weapons flashed. Through the chaos, he caught sight of a face he would later name John Fisher. Thin, sharp-eyed, Fisher moved with practiced violence, directing the attack as if the road itself belonged to him. The assault was swift, brutal, and calculated. Ross's goods were rifled through, his pockets searched, his body beaten until his breath came ragged and sharp. When at last the gang scattered, leaving him bloodied by the roadside, he knew he had survived something more than a simple robbery. The air around him smelled of iron, his own blood mixing with the dust, and every sound seemed amplified. The pounding of his heart, the groan of his horse shifting nervously, the faint creak of wagon wheels as they settled in the ruts. Ross staggered back to Charleston, his story carried by determination and outrage. He named the Fishers as the core of the gang, and in his words, the inn ceased to be rumor. It became the den of criminals, the nest of predators who turned hospitality into a weapon. The attack on David Ross hardened public suspicion into fury. Where whispers once flowed through taverns, now they roared. Ordinary citizens saw themselves in Ross. Any traveler could be dragged from the road, beaten and robbed within sight of the city. The name Fisher was no longer a rumor spoken in half-light. It was shouted in broad daylight as the people demanded justice. The poisoned tea, the vanishing guests, the trapdoors, these were chilling but uncertain. Ross's testimony, bloodied and bruised, was undeniable. His wounds spoke louder than rumor, and Charleston's citizens listened. The air in the city thickened with the urgency of vengeance. Soon, fear and fury would push the people to act where law had faltered. Pauses would gather, armed and resolute, to tear the Fishers from the safety of their inn and drag them toward judgment. Early 1820. Charleston was no longer willing to endure whispers and rumors without response. The attack on David Ross had lit a fire beneath the city, and now that fire burned unchecked. Citizens muttered angrily in taverns, voices cutting through the smoke and the sour smell of ale. Merchants at the market spoke in grim tones, warning travelers against venturing too close to the 6 Mile House. The sense of danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate, tangible, and intolerable. Charleston's law enforcement was thin, often powerless beyond the city limits. The roads north lay in a gray zone where authority faltered, and gangs exploited the gap. Highwaymen struck quickly and vanished into pine thickets before officials could respond. To many citizens, the Fishers were not merely part of the problem, they embodied it, and when law seemed unable to contain them, justice was claimed by the hands of the people. Groups of armed men formed in Charleston, ordinary citizens who traded work tools for muskets and pistols. Their boots pounded against the cobblestones as they marched out of the city, determination sharp in their voices. The air smelled of oil and powder as weapons were readied, the sound of ramrods striking barrels carrying like a drumbeat of intent. This was not law, but it was order of a kind, the order of men determined to purge their fears. The 6 Mile House became the focal point of their wrath. Its lantern, once a beacon for weary travelers, now marked a place of danger to be destroyed. Posses surrounded the inn, their shouts cutting through the night, demanding surrender. Inside, Lavinia and John Fisher were not alone. Reports spoke of a gang that lingered at the house, men who answered violence with defiance. Windows rattled with the pounding of fists, doors splintered under force. When the dust cleared, the Fishers and their associates were dragged from the house, bound by rope and guarded by citizens who no longer trusted officials to act swiftly. The smell of sweat, fear, and gunpowder lingered in the air as the inn, stripped of its menace, stood hollow in the background. What had once been a place of uneasy welcome now looked only like a shell, its reputation shattered, its inhabitants condemned. The line between justice and vengeance blurred. Some said the people had no right to seize authority. Others argued the Fishers had made a mockery of law and left no choice. In Charleston's charged atmosphere, few cared for such distinctions. What mattered was that the reign of terror on the northern road had ended, at least for now. From that night forward, the Fishers' fate was no longer in rumor or in the hands of frightened travelers. It rested in the formal process of Charleston's courts, where accusations of highway robbery would be weighed against them. Yet, even as officials took charge, the scent of mob justice clung to the case, a reminder that fear had brought the Fishers down as much as evidence. What began as rumor had become confrontation, and what began as whispers in taverns now thundered in courtrooms. The path from fear to law was set, and the Fishers would soon stand before it. February 1820. The Fishers, once keepers of an unremarkable roadside inn, now stood as prisoners in Charleston, their names uttered with equal parts fury and fascination. The jail that confined them smelled of damp stone and rusting iron, its corridors echoing with the clang of barred doors. Inside, Lavinia and John Fisher awaited judgment, bound not just by chains, but by a community's need for resolution. The charges that emerged were not of murder, despite the chilling tales that swirled around them. Instead, the law pursued them for highway robbery, a crime as serious as any in a city dependent on trade and safe passage. In Charleston, the robbery of travelers was not a petty theft. It was an assault on commerce, reputation, and the trust that bound the city to its roads. Conviction meant death. The trial unfolded in a courtroom thick with expectation. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of spectators, the air close with the mingling odors of ink, sweat, and candle smoke. At the front, stern-faced judges presided, their robes lending gravity to proceedings that felt less like a trial and more like a reckoning. Witnesses stepped forward, their voices steady yet edged with fear. David Ross described his brutal assault on the road, naming John Fisher as one of his attackers. His words carried the weight of blood spilled and dignity stolen, his bruises remembered, even if faded. Then came the retelling of John Peoples' narrow escape. Though never part of the formal charge, his story was repeated often enough to stain perception. He spoke of Lavinia's insistence on tea, of the bitterness that convinced him to feign sleep and flee. The courtroom murmured, the motif of poisoned tea tightening its grip on the city's imagination. Lavinia sat in silence through much of the testimony, her striking presence drawing every eye. Some claimed her gaze was cold, others insisted she showed no fear. Whether defiance or composure, it marked her as unforgettable. John, wiry and restless, listened with clenched jaw, as if each word were a stone hurled at him. Together, they were less defendants than characters in a tale the city had already written. The prosecution painted them as predators disguised as hosts, their inn a lure for the unsuspecting. The defense attempted to unravel the stories, pointing out the absence of bodies, the lack of physical proof of poisoned cups or collapsing beds. But the courtroom did not hunger for ambiguity. It wanted certainty, and it wanted closure. When the verdict came, it was as heavy as the silence that preceded it. Guilty of highway robbery. The punishment was death by hanging. Gasps rippled through the crowd, though most had expected nothing less. The Fishers' names, etched into Charleston's collective memory, were now bound to the gallows. Appeals were attempted, petitions raised, but they met with little sympathy. The city, restless and watchful, had no desire to release the figures who had embodied its fears. The scent of tea and the creak of shifting beds lingered in the minds of jurors and spectators alike, stronger than any argument of evidence. The jail held them once more, but the wait was different now. Lavinia and John Fisher no longer waited for trial, they waited for the scaffold. The city, having demanded justice, now prepared to witness its execution. From rumor to road, from inn to courtroom, the path of the Fishers was nearly complete. The last chapter of their lives would unfold not in secret, but before the eyes of Charleston. under the looming beams of the gallows. February 1820. The verdict had been delivered, and with it came the weight of inevitability. John and Lavinia Fisher were condemned to die by hanging. The Charleston jail that held them, a hulking stone structure with barred windows and thick iron doors, carried the damp chill of finality. The smell of mildew clung to its walls, mingling with the acrid smoke of tallow candles that burned dimly in the corridors. Within those walls, the Fishers awaited their fate. Appeals had been filed, words written and spoken in desperate attempts to overturn the sentence, but each effort collapsed beneath the city's determination. Charleston's citizens demanded closure, and closure in this case meant death. Their crimes were recorded as highway robbery, yet the shadows of rumor and legend clung to their names like a shroud. Few spoke of stolen goods alone. Most whispered still of poisoned tea and vanishing travelers. John Fisher paced the narrow cell, restless as always, his wiry frame moving from wall to wall. He prayed, pleaded, and cursed in turn. Desperation wore him thin, and the echo of his steps filled the chamber like a drumbeat of futility. His words carried the smell of sweat and fear, sharp and sour in the stagnant air. Lavinia, by contrast, remained a figure of unsettling composure. Striking in her presence even within the shadows of confinement, she carried herself as though defiance were armor. Some jailers claimed she met her fate with chilling calm, while others swore they heard her voice ring sharp with anger at the injustice she believed she faced. Whatever her inner turmoil, outwardly she refused to bend. Their appeals wound their way through the courts, but each petition struck against the same wall: Charleston's thirst for justice. Citizens had no interest in reprieve. Too much fear had grown along the northern road. Too many tales had taken root. The Fishers had become symbols, and symbols could not be spared without unraveling the fragile sense of order. Execution loomed ever closer. The gallows were prepared, their wooden beams rising stark against the sky. The smell of freshly cut timber clung to the structure, mingling with the iron tang of nails hammered deep into the frame. It was more than a scaffold. It was the stage upon which Charleston would purge itself of fear. In those final days, the Fishers became a study in contrast. John, restless and despairing, clung to faith and begged for forgiveness. Lavinia, proud and unyielding, declared that she would not submit meekly. She was said to have laughed at the idea of repentance, insisting instead that she would meet her death on her own terms. The jail, heavy with silence, seemed to hold its breath. Outside, citizens gathered rumors of the couple's final hours, eager for spectacle. Charleston prepared not only for justice, but for drama, for the theater of the gallows where sin and defiance would be displayed before the crowd. The condemned had only days left, and each passing hour carried them closer to the scaffold's shadow. The air of Charleston thickened with anticipation, the scent of smoke and salt from the harbor mixing with the unshakable knowledge that an ending approached. Soon, the rope would be tightened, the crowd assembled, and the story of Lavinia and John Fisher would reach its brutal climax. February 18, 1820. Charleston awoke with a chill in the air, the kind that clung to skin and made every sound seem sharper. Word had spread swiftly through the city. John and Lavinia Fisher were to hang that morning. By dawn, crowds pressed into the streets, boots grinding dirt into the cobblestones, their voices hushed with anticipation. The harbor smelled of salt and tar, but nearer the jail, the air was thick with the resinous scent of freshly cut pine, the timber of the gallows awaiting its grim purpose. The prisoners were led out under heavy guard, iron shackles clanking with each step. John Fisher walked first, thin shoulders slumped, his face pale beneath a wiry tangle of hair. His lips moved in prayer, whispered fragments carried away by the breeze. Behind him came Lavinia, striking in her defiance. Even bound, she seemed to command the crowd's gaze, her dark eyes sharp, her jaw set with fierce determination. The scaffold loomed above them, beams stark against the winter sky. The crowd pressed closer, the creak of wood under their shifting weight echoing like a chorus. Mothers clutched children, merchants leaned from wagons, sailors jostled for a clearer view. It was not only justice they sought, but spectacle, a public purging of fear that had haunted Charleston for years. John mounted the steps first. He trembled as the noose was placed around his neck, his voice breaking as he prayed aloud. He begged forgiveness for his sins, pleaded for mercy from the Almighty, and warned the crowd against lives of crime. His words carried the rhythm of desperation, heavy with the scent of fear. Moments later, the rope tightened, and his voice was silenced. The crowd shifted uneasily, the air filled with the faint groan of timber. Then came Lavinia. Unlike her husband, she offered no plea for mercy. Legend tells that she refused the minister's prayers, declaring she would have nothing to do with hypocrites. Her voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and unyielding. She scanned the crowd as if daring them to meet her gaze. Accounts differ on her final words, but all agree they burned with defiance. Some claimed she shouted at the people, cursing them. Others swore she delivered one final taunt. "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, and I'll carry it." Whatever the truth, her last words clung to Charleston like smoke. As the noose tightened, the crowd drew silent. The moment stretched, broken only by the creak of the rope and the rush of wind across the scaffold. Lavinia Fisher, America's so-called first female serial killer, met death not with fear, but with unyielding defiance. The crowd shifted, unsettled by her courage, perhaps even unnerved by it. When the bodies were cut down, Charleston exhaled as though releasing years of dread. The Fishers were gone, but their legend had only begun to take shape. The smell of pine from the gallows lingered, mixing with dust and sea air, an invisible reminder of the day justice and myth collided. What remained was not only the memory of their deaths, but the birth of a story, one that would grow beyond fact into something far larger, something haunting. And it was in the telling afterward, in newspapers and whispered recollections, that Lavinia Fisher ceased to be merely a woman condemned and became a legend of horror. The gallows had claimed the Fishers, but in Charleston the story did not end with the ropes. In fact, their deaths marked the beginning of something larger than either life had been. By the spring of 1820, taverns, market stalls, and even pulpits buzzed with retellings of what had unfolded. Each version shifted slightly, details bent or sharpened to meet the needs of the listener. What was certain in court, highway robbery, became something darker in the mouths of storytellers. The smell of pine from the scaffold had hardly faded before stories of poisoned tea and trapdoors surged with renewed force. Neighbors described Lavinia as a temptress who lured men to ruin. Strangers claimed that countless bodies had been buried near the 6 Mile House, though no such remains were ever discovered. Fear craved narrative, and narrative delivered certainty where evidence had not. Charleston's newspapers contributed to the legend, sometimes with deliberate embellishment. Columns portrayed Lavinia as wicked beyond redemption, a figure almost theatrical in her defiance. Her supposed last words were repeated with relish, each reprint amplifying her image as unrepentant and fearless. To the public imagination, she became a symbol of danger, America's first female serial killer, whether or not the facts supported it. Travelers who passed through Charleston carried the tale farther afield. By the time they reached Savannah, Augusta, or even inland settlements, the story had grown teeth. Men swore the Fishers had constructed elaborate death traps beneath their inn. Women repeated the chilling image of a hostess who smiled as she offered a cup of poison. Children grew up hearing that if they misbehaved, Lavinia Fisher's ghost might come for them at night. The motif of tea lingered, bitter as wormwood. Generations would recall the detail of the steaming cup pressed insistently into a guest's hands, a small gesture that carried lethal intent. It was the image of hospitality perverted, comfort turned into betrayal. The sensory memory of it, the fragrance sharp, the taste bitter, ensured the tale endured. In death, Lavinia Fisher became something she had not fully been in life, a story that people wanted to believe. She embodied the fears of travelers, the anxieties of women stepping outside prescribed roles, the cautionary tale of unchecked wickedness. Each time her name was spoken, it gained weight, the legend growing more potent than the woman herself had ever been. And as decades passed, Charleston leaned into the story. Guides would later lead visitors past the old jail, pointing to its weathered walls and claiming her restless spirit remained within. The 6 Mile House vanished into history, but the ghost of its reputation lingered, as though the creak of its beds and the smell of bitter tea had never left. From gallows to folklore, Lavinia Fisher's journey revealed how swiftly fact can dissolve into legend and how a community's fears can be immortalized through story. Yet beneath the embellishments, the truth remained buried. What had she actually done, and what had been invented? That question, fact or folklore, would come to define the Fisher legacy, pulling historians into a tangle of uncertainty that has never been fully unraveled. Decades after the hangings, Charleston's memory of John and Lavinia Fisher existed less as history and more as a cautionary tale. Yet when scholars and archivists began to sift through the records, a striking gap appeared between the legend and the documented truth. Court transcripts, arrest reports, and trial notes confirmed robbery, yes, but not murder. No bodies were ever exhumed near the 6 Mile house. No poison was ever tested. No trapdoor diagram ever drawn. What the courts proved and what the people believed were two very different stories. The motif of tea lingered, though. In sworn testimony, the cup appeared not as evidence of poison, but as a gesture. Hospitality offered, suspicion raised. Margaret Brown, the traveler who had survived her visit, spoke of unease rather than physical harm. Yet Charleston's collective imagination had already transformed that teacup into a vessel of death. The bitter taste was too perfect a symbol of betrayal to be forgotten. Historians noted how much of the serial killer narrative emerged only after the executions. Newspapers, seeking readership, framed Lavinia as more than a thief. She became an embodiment of female villainy, a character drawn from Gothic fiction as much as from life. In a city still haunted by unrest, her story gave shape to fear. The gender of the accused played no small part in the legend's growth. A male highwayman might be feared, but a woman accused of calculated murder defied the boundaries of expectation. Lavinia's defiance at the scaffold, whatever her precise words, cemented her as a figure both reviled and enthralling. She became a mirror in which Charleston projected anxieties about women, crime, and power. As scholars traced the story's evolution, they found embellishments layered like sediment. Some accounts insisted travelers vanished by the dozen, though no names could be provided. Others painted the Fishers as masterminds of a murderous inn, though no material evidence survived. By the 20th century, the tale had transformed fully into ghost story. Lavinia Fisher invoked not in courtrooms, but on candlelit walking tours. And still the question lingers. Was she truly a killer, or the creation of fearful imaginations? The line between fact and folklore blurred until even careful researchers struggled to separate them. What remained were fragments, legal documents that proved robbery, folklore that insisted murder, and a legend that refused to die. Charleston itself seemed content with the uncertainty. Tour guides, preservationists, and local writers leaned into the myth, aware that stories endure where facts fade. The old city jail, its stone walls weathered and scarred, became less a place of history than a stage for spectral retellings. Visitors walked its halls, swearing they felt a presence, catching the faint scent of tea where no cup remained. The truth, obscured beneath layers of myth, left a chilling question at the heart of the Fisher saga. Was Lavinia a criminal elevated into infamy, or an innocent caught in the machinery of fear and rumor? That unresolved tension between fact and fiction would carry her story into the modern age, ensuring her name never faded from Charleston's collective memory. Night settles thick over Charleston, draping the cobblestones in a hush broken only by the clatter of carriages and the distant clang of ship bells. When the day's bustle fades, another voice rises, the city's ghostly memory. It is in this twilight atmosphere that the name Lavinia Fisher is spoken most often, not in courts or classrooms, but on lantern-lit tours and whispered stories passed to eager listeners. The old city jail, its stone walls scarred by centuries, has become the nucleus of her legend. Guides lead groups through crumbling corridors where iron bars rust with age and the smell of damp stone clings like a second skin. They pause at the stairwells and cells, lowering their voices as they describe how Lavinia once paced these halls, her fury and defiance echoing long after the hangman's rope silenced her. Some claim her ghost lingers still, pacing behind unseen doors, her footsteps muffled but insistent. Visitors describe sudden chills sweeping over them in stagnant rooms, the brush of unseen hands, or the sharp tang of smoke where no fire burns. Others swear they hear a woman's voice, sharp and mocking, carried faintly through the corridors. The scent of bitter tea, out of place in the musty air, has been reported more than once, a ghostly reminder of the poisoned hospitality that defined her story. Charleston, a city built upon layers of tragedy, slavery, fire, and war, has no shortage of restless spirits. Yet, Lavinia Fisher endures as one of its most famous phantoms, her story retold more often than many who left deeper marks in the historical record. The image of her white dress at the gallows, whether fact or invention, offers storytellers a perfect visual, a woman defiant, facing death with fire in her eyes. The tourism industry seized her legend, polishing it until it gleamed with Gothic allure. Brochures call her America's first female serial killer, a claim repeated so often it feels like truth, despite historians' caution. Haunted carriage rides pass by the jail, their wheels rattling over stones as narrators weave Lavinia's tale for wide-eyed visitors. Children press against their parents, half frightened, half delighted, while the city itself profits from the ghost it created. Yet beneath the entertainment lies something more somber. Her legend speaks to Charleston's uneasy relationship with its past, the way crime, punishment, and spectacle intertwine, and the way myth sometimes buries the truth. Whether guilty of murder or not, Lavinia Fisher has become inseparable from the identity of Charleston itself. Her presence a reminder that the line between memory and story is fragile. As night deepens, the jail looms like a monument to unfinished history, its stones holding secrets too long unsorted. And through those secrets, one figure lingers, her voice not entirely silenced, her story still shifting with each retelling. What began with a trial and a scaffold has become an endless haunting, ensuring that Lavinia Fisher's name will never fully rest in peace. 2 centuries have passed since the ropes tightened at Charleston's gallows, yet the name Lavinia Fisher still flickers across history's stage. She remains both a figure of dread and fascination, woven into the city's identity as tightly as its cobblestones. Some call her America's first female serial killer. Others insist she was merely a highway robber cast as a monster by rumor and fear. That duality is her legacy, a life consumed by legend until truth itself became elusive. The motif of tea still clings to her memory, that bitter image of poisoned hospitality. It surfaces in guidebooks, in ghost tours, in the minds of those who picture her smiling as she handed travelers their final drink. It is an image more powerful than the surviving court records, more enduring than the trial transcripts tucked away in archives. Symbol overcame substance, and Lavinia Fisher became less a person than an emblem of treachery and intrigue. Her story reveals how communities shape their fears into myths. Charleston, unsettled by crime, unrest, and uncertainty, found in her an outlet, a narrative of wickedness punished, but also one that could be retold for generations. That story has been polished, stretched, and embellished until it now belongs as much to folklore as to history. Yet, in another sense, the legend grants her a form of immortality. Few highway robbers or petty criminals are remembered 200 years later, their names still spoken in hushed tones by strangers from distant places. Lavinia Fisher achieved in death what few achieve in life. She became unforgettable. Whether guilty of the crimes legend claims, or merely the victim of embellishment, her legacy persists in Charleston's haunted tours, in the stones of the old city jail, and in the chilling whisper of her supposed last words. Each retelling renews her story, ensuring that truth and myth remain entangled, and so her shadow stretches into the present, a reminder that history is rarely clean, that stories sometimes matter more than facts, and that once a name is bound to legend, it never truly fades. If this tale of Lavinia Fisher has unsettled or intrigued you, stay with us for more haunting histories, and remember to subscribe so you never miss the stories that linger in the dark.